Marcus Williams never imagined that 75 cents and a moment of curiosity would transform him from sleeping under highway overpasses to owning the most talked-about mansion in Cedar Falls, Montana. What he discovered inside a rusted metal container at a Saturday morning yard sale didn't just change his life. It rewrote the entire history of their small mountain town. This is the story of how one man's desperate gamble on what everyone else called junk became the discovery that made millionaires out of ordinary people and turned a forgotten piece of American history into front-page news across the nation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The November wind cut through Marcus Williams' torn jacket like frozen razors as he shuffled down Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Montana. His boots, held together more by duct tape than leather, left uneven prints in the light dusting of snow that had fallen overnight. The digital clock outside First National Bank read 6:47 a.m. and -12 degrees. Marcus had been awake since 4, when the cardboard beneath his sleeping bag had finally given way to the moisture seeping through the concrete drainage tunnel where he'd spent another restless night. Cedar Falls had once been a thriving railroad town, back when the copper mines in the surrounding mountains still produced enough ore to justify the daily freight runs to Billings. Now, with most of the mines shuttered and the last train having passed through nearly a decade ago, the town existed in that peculiar state of slow-motion collapse that defines so many small American communities. The population had dwindled from 8,000 to just under 3,000, and those who remained were either too old to leave, too poor to start over somewhere else, or too stubborn to admit that their hometown's best days were buried as deep as the played-out copper veins in the hills. Marcus fell into the second category, though stubbornness played a role too. He'd grown up here, graduated from Cedar Falls High School with decent grades and big dreams of studying geology at Montana State University. Those dreams had derailed spectacularly when his father died in a mining accident during Marcus's senior year, leaving behind a mountain of medical debt and a mortgage on their small house that his mother's waitressing income couldn't possibly cover. Instead of college, Marcus had taken a job at the last operating mine, Henderson Copper Works, figuring he'd work for a few years, pay down the family debts, and then pursue his education. That plan had lasted exactly 18 months, until Henderson Copper announced they were closing permanently. The severance package barely covered 2 months of expenses. Marcus had tried everything after that. Construction work when he could find it, odd jobs, even a brief stint working at the feed store outside town. But steady employment in Cedar Falls had become as rare as the copper ore that had once built. The community. The breaking point had come 8 months ago when his mother suffered a stroke. The medical bills from her 3-week hospital stay in Billings had consumed what little savings remained, and without steady income, Marcus couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments. The bank had been patient at first, offering payment plans and extensions, but patience has its limits in the lending business. The foreclosure notice had arrived on a Tuesday in March, giving them 30 days to vacate. His mother had moved in with her sister in Great Falls, insisting that Marcus come too, but he'd refused. Partly it was pride. At 32, moving in with his aunt felt like admitting complete defeat. Mostly, though, it was the irrational hope that something would turn around in Cedar Falls, that some opportunity would present itself if he just stayed long enough to find it. That hope had sustained him through the first month of sleeping in his rusted pickup truck, then through the second month when he'd had to sell the truck for grocery money and transition to the abandoned buildings and drainage tunnels that served as shelter for Cedar Falls' small but persistent homeless population. The town had 3 other regular homeless residents that Marcus knew of. Jenny Morrison, a former nurse whose life had been destroyed by prescription drug addiction. Dale Crawford, a Vietnam veteran whose pension checks never seemed to stretch far enough. and Tommy Chen, a young man with severe mental health issues whose family had moved away years ago, leaving him to navigate the world with whatever support the overwhelmed county social services could provide. They formed an unlikely community, sharing information about which buildings were safe to sleep in, where to find day-old bread from the grocery store, and how to stay warm when the Montana winter showed no mercy. Marcus had never imagined he'd become part of such a group, but life has a way of humbling even the most carefully laid plans. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort, though the ache in his bones from sleeping on concrete was a constant reminder of his circumstances. It wasn't even the looks he got from former neighbors and classmates, those carefully averted gazes that spoke volumes about how uncomfortable his presence made them feel. The worst part was the gradual erosion of hope, the slow realization that each day brought him further from the life he'd once expected to live and deeper into a situation that seemed to have no exit strategy. Marcus had always been resourceful. His father had taught him to fix engines, work with his hands, and find solutions to mechanical problems. But homelessness presented challenges that couldn't be solved with the right wrench or a little ingenuity. It was a web of interconnected obstacles. You couldn't get a job without an address, couldn't rent an apartment without a job, couldn't stay clean and presentable without a place to shower regularly. Each barrier reinforced the others, creating a cycle that felt increasingly impossible to break. On this particular November morning, Marcus was heading toward the Salvation Army office, which opened at 8 and sometimes had day labor opportunities. The work was usually manual, loading trucks, cleaning buildings, yard maintenance, and it paid cash, which meant Marcus could earn enough for food without the complications of direct deposit or tax withholdings that required a permanent address. The pay was minimal, rarely more than $50 or $60 for a full day's work, but it was honest money, and it kept him from having to resort to panhandling or worse alternatives. The Salvation Army office was located in a converted storefront on Main Street, between Harriman's hardware store and what used to be Peterson's Five and Dime before it closed down 3 years ago. Marcus arrived at 7:30 and found Jenny Morrison already waiting outside, smoking a cigarette and stamping her feet to stay warm. She nodded when she saw him approaching. "Morning, Marcus. Cold enough for you?" "Could be worse," Marcus replied, though he wasn't sure how. Jenny was in her late 40s, with graying hair that she kept pulled back in a ponytail, and intelligent eyes that hadn't lost their sharpness despite everything she'd been through. Before, her addiction had cost her both her nursing license and her family. She'd worked at the county hospital and had been known for her skill with difficult patients. Now she survived on whatever day of labor she could find, and the small disability check she received for a back injury sustained in a car accident years earlier. "You hear about the Hendersons?" Jenny asked, taking another drag from her cigarette. Marcus shook his head. The Hendersons were one of the founding families of Cedar Falls, descendants of the man who'd originally discovered copper in the area back in the 1890s. They'd owned the biggest house in town, a Victorian mansion on Hill Street with a wraparound, a porch and a 3-car garage, though the family's fortunes had declined along with everyone else's as the mining industry collapsed. "Estate sale this weekend," Jenny continued. "Old Mrs. Henderson died last month, and apparently her kids live back east somewhere. They're selling everything and putting the house on the market." Marcus felt a familiar pang at this news. Another piece of Cedar Falls history disappearing, another family giving up on the town that had given up on them. He'd known Mrs. Henderson, slightly. She'd been friends with his mother and had always been kind to him when he was younger. The idea of strangers going through her belongings and hauling away everything she'd accumulated over a lifetime felt somehow disrespectful, though he understood the practical necessity of it. "Might be worth checking out," Jenny added. "Estate sales sometimes have good deals on warm clothes, blankets, things like that." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure he'd have money to spend on anything, even at estate sale prices. His last day, of work had been 3 days ago, helping to clean out a rental property, and the $25 he'd earned was already mostly gone on food. He had exactly $2.37 in his pocket, which might be enough for a cup of coffee and a donut at the diner if he was lucky. At 8 o'clock sharp, Patricia Williams, no relation despite the shared surname, unlocked the door to the Salvation Army office. She was a heavy-set woman in her 60s who'd been running the local office for nearly 20 years. She'd seen the town's decline firsthand and had developed a no-nonsense approach to helping people that was both practical and compassionate. "Morning, Jenny, Marcus," she said, ushering them inside where the blessed warmth from a space heater took some of the bite out of the cold. "I've got some work today if you're interested. Mrs. Patterson needs her gutters cleaned before the snow gets heavy, and the Methodist Church is looking for someone to stack firewood for their winter heating." Both jobs sounded appealing to Marcus, who was eager for any opportunity to earn money. The gutter cleaning would pay $40 and the firewood stacking another $30, which would be enough to buy food for several days and maybe even rent a motel room for a night if he was careful with his spending. "I'll take the gutters," Marcus said quickly. "And I'll handle the firewood," Jenny added. Patricia nodded and made notes in her ledger. She provided Marcus with Mrs. Patterson's address and told him to check back in the afternoon for his payment. The work arrangement was simple. The Salvation Army would pay him directly for the completed job, taking a small administrative fee, but ensuring that people without bank accounts could still earn legitimate income. Mrs. Patterson lived in a modest, ranch-style house on Cedar Street, about a mile from downtown. She was a widow in her 70s, whose husband had worked as a foreman at Henderson Copper Works back in the day. She greeted Marcus warmly and showed him where she kept the ladder and cleaning supplies. "I used to be able to do this myself," she explained, "but at my age, climbing ladders isn't the smart thing to do anymore. I appreciate you helping out." The work was straightforward but physically demanding. The gutters hadn't been cleaned in at least 2 years and were clogged with leaves, pine needles, and the accumulated debris of several seasons. Marcus worked methodically, moving the ladder along the house's perimeter and clearing each section thoroughly. The physical labor felt good after days of inactivity, and there was something satisfying about seeing the immediate results of his efforts. Mrs. Patterson brought him a thermos of hot coffee around midday, along with a sandwich wrapped in foil. "You look like you could use a good meal," she said kindly, and Marcus accepted the food gratefully. It'd been nearly 24 hours since his last substantial meal, and the sandwich, thick slices of roast beef on homemade bread, was better than anything he'd eaten in weeks. As he worked, Marcus found himself thinking about Jenny's mention of the Henderson estate sale. He'd driven past the Henderson house countless times over the years, admiring its elegant architecture and well-maintained gardens. The house represented everything that Cedar Falls had once been: prosperous, established, built to last. Now, it would probably be sold to someone from out of state who'd either turn it into a vacation rental or let it sit empty most of the year, another piece of the community's heritage transformed into a real estate investment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink behind the mountains when Marcus finished cleaning the last section of gutters. Mrs. Patterson inspected his work and pronounced herself satisfied, then handed him 2 crisp $20 bills. "You did excellent work," she told him. "If you're looking for more jobs, you might mention to Patricia that I'll need my driveway shoveled this winter whenever it snows heavily." Marcus thanked her and walked back toward downtown, feeling better than he had in days. The $40 represented temporary security, enough for food, maybe a night indoors if the weather got really bad, and a small cushion against the constant uncertainty of his situation. It wasn't a solution to his problems, but it was progress, and progress was something to hold on to. The sun was setting by the time he reached Main Street, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected off the snow-capped peaks, surrounding Cedar Falls. Despite everything, it was still a beautiful place, and Marcus understood why his ancestors had chosen to settle here, even if the economic forces that had sustained the town for over a century were now working against it. He stopped at Morrison's grocery store, the only supermarket left in town since the larger chain store had closed 2 years earlier. With his newfound wealth, Marcus could afford to be selective about his purchases. He bought bread, peanut butter, a package of cheese, some apples, and a can of coffee that he could prepare with hot water from the gas station if necessary. The total came to $18.43, leaving him with $21.94, more money than he'd had at one time in several weeks. As he walked back toward the drainage tunnel where he'd been sleeping, Marcus passed the Henderson house on Hill Street. A large sign had been posted in the front yard, announcing the estate sale, scheduled for Saturday and Sunday from 9 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. The house looked sad in the gathering darkness, its windows dark and its gardens showing the first signs of neglect. Marcus had no real intention of attending the estate sale. Even with his recent earnings, he couldn't afford to spend money on household goods or furniture that he had no place to put. But something about the sign nagged at him as he settled into his makeshift shelter for another cold night. Maybe it was the connection to his mother, who'd been friends with Mrs. Henderson. Maybe it was just curiosity about what the inside of such a grand house looked like. Or maybe it was the faint, probably foolish hope that there might be something there, some tool or piece of equipment that could help him find steady work, or clothing that would help him look more presentable for job interviews. The next morning dawned grey and overcast, with the promise of snow in the heavy clouds that hung low over the mountains. Marcus woke with his usual collection of aches and pains from sleeping on concrete, but his spirits were higher than they'd been in weeks. He had money in his pocket, food in his backpack, and the prospect of more work from Patricia at the Salvation Army office. He spent the day helping Dale Crawford collect aluminum cans from around town, a task that required more walking than Marcus was used to, but paid $15 for several hours of work. Dale was a quiet man in his late 60s, methodical in his approach to can collecting and generous about sharing the locations where people regularly discarded recyclables. They worked well together, and by evening Marcus had earned enough to bring his total cash to just over $36. Saturday morning arrived clear and cold, with a bright sun that made the snow sparkle but did nothing to warm the air. Marcus had spent the night in an abandoned garage behind the old train station, a spot that Dale had recommended as being slightly warmer than the drainage tunnel but harder for the occasional police patrol to spot. He woke early and walked downtown to the diner, where he used some of his precious cash to buy a cup of coffee and a day-old donut for breakfast. The diner was busier than usual, filled with the kind of people who attended estate sales: retirees looking for antiques, young couples hunting for furniture they could afford, dealers hoping to find valuable items that the family had overlooked or underpriced. Marcus listened to their conversations as he nursed his coffee, absorbing information about what kinds of things were supposedly available at the Henderson sale. "I heard they've got some beautiful china," one woman was telling her friend. "The kind of stuff you don't see anymore, real hand-painted pieces." "What about tools?" a man at the counter asked the waitress. "My buddy said old Henderson had a workshop in the basement with some vintage equipment." Marcus finished his coffee and stepped back outside, where the morning sun was beginning to take some of the edge off the cold. He had no specific destination in mind, but his feet seemed to carry him naturally toward Hill Street and the Henderson house. He told himself he was just curious, that he had no intention of actually spending any of his limited money on items. he couldn't use or store. The estate sale was already busy by the time Marcus arrived at 9:30. Cars lined both sides of Hill Street, and a steady stream of people was flowing in and out of the Henderson house's front door. A hand-lettered sign directed visitors to register at a card table set up on the front porch, where a woman with steel grey hair and an efficient manner was checking people in and handing out small paper bags for their purchases. Marcus hesitated at the foot of the porch steps. He looked down at his clothes, clean but obviously worn and patched, and wondered if he really belonged among the well-dressed suburban treasure hunters who made up most of the crowd. Then he remembered that this was America, where anybody with money to spend was welcome, and he climbed the steps to register. "First time at one of our sales?" the grey-haired woman asked as she handed him a numbered tag and a paper bag. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied. "Everything's priced clearly, but if you have questions, just ask. We're the Morrison Estate Sale Company. We handle these things professionally." She gestured toward the front door. "The valuable items are mostly in the living room and dining room. Household goods, books and miscellaneous items are upstairs and in the basement. Tools and garage items are out back." Marcus thanked her and joined the flow of people entering the house. The interior was even more impressive than he'd imagined. High ceilings, ornate woodwork, and rooms filled with the accumulated possessions of several generations. In the living room, serious-looking buyers were examining pieces of furniture and decorative items, some of which had price tags that exceeded Marcus's entire net worth. He moved through the main floor quickly, feeling out of place among the antique collectors and interior designers who were discussing the finer points of Victorian-era craftsmanship. The upstairs rooms were more accessible, filled with clothing, books, linens, and smaller household items. Marcus found several warm sweaters priced reasonably and a heavy winter coat that looked like it might fit him, though at $12 it represented a significant portion of his available money. The basement was where most of the other bargain hunters had congregated. Tables and shelves held an eclectic mixture of items that hadn't made it to the main floor display: old magazines, kitchen appliances, sporting goods, and boxes of miscellaneous items that were priced to move quickly. Marcus spent nearly an hour exploring the basement, not so much shopping as marveling at the sheer volume of possessions one family could accumulate over the decades. In a corner near the furnace, he found a collection of items that appeared to have come from Mr. Henderson's workshop. There were hand tools, some clearly vintage and valuable, others showing the wear of regular use. A small lathe was priced at $200, far beyond Marcus's reach, but interesting to examine. Boxes of nuts, bolts, and hardware were marked at 50 cents each, and there were several pieces of test equipment that looked like they might have been used for geological surveying. It was while examining a box of what appeared to be rock and mineral samples that Marcus noticed the metal container sitting by itself on a lower shelf. It was roughly the size of a shoebox, but made of steel, with a hinged lid and a simple latch closure. The metal was heavily rusted, particularly around the edges and corners, giving it the appearance of something that had been stored in a damp basement for many years. A small price tag attached to the handle read 75 CR in faded pencil. Marcus picked up the container and immediately noticed its weight. Despite its modest size, it felt substantial, as if it contained something dense and heavy. He shook it gently and heard a muffled rattling from inside, like multiple small objects moving around. The latch was corroded, but still functional, and Marcus briefly considered opening it to see what was inside, before deciding that would be inappropriate without purchasing it first. 75 cents was within his budget, barely, but Marcus hesitated. What could possibly be inside a rusted metal box that would justify even such a small expenditure? More likely, it contained old bolts, forgotten hardware, or other workshop debris that Mr. Henderson had stored away and never bothered to sort through. On the other hand, 75 cents wouldn't make or break his current financial situation, and there was something appealing about the mystery of it. Marcus had always been curious by nature, a trait that had served him well in his abandoned geology studies and in his various mechanical jobs over the years. The unknown contents of the metal box presented a puzzle, and despite his practical circumstances, he found the puzzle irresistible. Besides, if the box contained nothing of value, he could always donate it back to the Salvation Army or find some other use for a sturdy metal container. He carried the box upstairs and paid the gray-haired woman 75 cents, leaving him with $36.19 in available cash. She wrapped the box in newspaper and placed it in his paper bag without comment, as if rusted metal containers were purchased regularly at estate sales. Marcus left the Henderson house feeling slightly foolish about his impulse purchase, but also oddly excited about the prospect of discovering what Mr. Henderson had deemed worth storing in such a secure container. The weight and the rattling sound suggested something more interesting than random hardware, though Marcus tried to keep his expectations realistic. He walked back toward downtown, intending to find a private place where he could examine his purchase without attracting attention. The old train station seemed like the ideal location. It was abandoned but provided shelter from the wind, and the loading platform offered good natural light for examining small objects. The train station had been built in the early 1900s during Cedar Falls' boom years, a substantial brick building with high windows and decorative stonework that spoke to the optimism of that era. Now the windows were boarded up and weeds grew through cracks in the platform, but the basic structure remained sound. Marcus had spent several nights in the station during his early weeks of homelessness before discovering more comfortable alternatives. He settled onto a bench on the platform and carefully removed the metal box from his paper bag. In the bright afternoon sunlight, the rust was even more apparent, creating patterns of reddish-brown corrosion across the steel surface. The latch moved stiffly, but opened with a metallic click that echoed off the empty platform. Marcus lifted the lid and felt his breath catch in his throat. The box was nearly full of what appeared to be gold coins, each one individually wrapped in tissue paper and nestled carefully within the container. There were also several small leather pouches that clinked softly when Marcus touched them, suggesting they contained additional coins or other precious metals. At the very bottom of the box, beneath the coins, was a folded piece of paper that looked like it might contain writing. Marcus stared at the contents for several long moments, unable to quite process what he was seeing. Gold coins were not something he'd expected to find at an estate sale in Cedar Falls, Montana, especially not for 75 cents. His first thought was that they might be replicas or commemorative coins with little actual value, but even replica gold coins seemed unlikely to be discarded so casually. With trembling fingers, he lifted one of the wrapped coins from the box and carefully peeled away the tissue paper. The coin was roughly the size of a silver dollar, but distinctly golden in color, with markings and text that Marcus didn't immediately recognize. On one side was what appeared to be a coat of arms or official seal, and on the other was text in a language that might have been Latin. Marcus was no expert in precious metals, but the coin felt heavy and substantial in a way that suggested genuine gold rather than a cheaper alloy. The surface had the soft luster that he associated with real gold jewelry, and there were no obvious signs of plating or artificial coloring. He unwrapped two more coins and found them to be similar in size and weight, but different in design. One appeared to be much older, with worn edges and faded markings that suggested considerable age. The other was in pristine condition, as if it had been minted recently and never circulated. Marcus set the coins aside and lifted one of the small leather pouches from the box. It was tied closed with a drawstring and felt like it contained perhaps a dozen small objects. When he opened it and poured the contents into his palm, he found himself looking at what appeared to be uncut gemstones, rough diamonds, emeralds, and rubies in various sizes, along with several stones he couldn't identify. The second pouch contained more of the same, though these stones appeared to have been cut and polished. They caught the afternoon sunlight and threw it back in brilliant flashes of color that seemed almost impossibly bright. Marcus had seen jewelry before, of course, but never gems of this apparent quality and size. The third pouch was the heaviest and contained what looked like small gold bars or ingots, each one stamped with markings that suggested they had been assayed and certified for purity. There were 8 bars in total, each roughly the size and shape of a stick of chewing gum, but considerably heavier. Marcus carefully returned everything to the box and picked up the folded piece of paper from the bottom. The paper was yellowed with age and felt brittle to the touch, as if it might crumble if handled too roughly. He unfolded it carefully and found himself looking at handwritten text in faded blue ink. The handwriting was old-fashioned but legible, and the text appeared to be some kind of inventory or record-keeping document. At the top of the page was written, Henderson Private Collection, acquired 1923-1956, followed by a detailed list of items that corresponded closely to what Marcus had found in the box. According to the document, the coins included genuine Roman aureus pieces dating from the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, several Spanish colonial coins from the 1600s, and a collection of American gold eagles from the late 1800s. The gemstones were described as uncut, specimens acquired from Colorado mining operations, and finished stones purchased from European dealers. The gold bars were listed as assayed pure gold, 24 carat, total weight approximately 12 troy ounces. At the bottom of the page, in the same careful handwriting, was a note that made Marcus's hands shake as he read it. Collection assembled over 33 years of careful acquisition. Estimated total value as of 1956, $47,000, hidden from family due to concerns about gambling debts and poor financial judgment. To be retrieved when circumstances improve. R.H. Marcus read the note 3 times before the implications fully sank in. R.H. presumably stood for Robert Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's late husband, who had apparently assembled this collection over several decades and then hidden it from his own family. The 1956 date was nearly 70 years ago, which meant that if the collection had been valuable then, it would be worth many times more now, given the increase in precious metal prices over the intervening decades. But even more significant than the potential monetary value was what the discovery meant for Marcus personally. If the collection was genuine, and everything he'd seen suggested it was, then he had just purchased what might be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars for less than $1 at an estate sale where the seller had no idea what they were offering. Marcus closed the box and sat back on the bench, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. For 8 months he'd been living day to day, struggling to find enough money for food and shelter, watching his life spiral further and further from anything resembling stability or hope. Now, in the space of a few minutes, everything had changed. If the collection was as valuable as it appeared to be, Marcus would have enough money not just to get back on his feet, but to completely transform his life and potentially the lives of others in Cedar Falls who were struggling with the same economic challenges that had brought him so low. He could buy a house, start a business, maybe even help revitalize some of the abandoned buildings downtown that were slowly crumbling from neglect. But first, he needed to verify what he'd found and figure out the best way to convert the precious metals and gems into usable currency without attracting unwanted attention or legal complications. The fact that Robert Henderson had hidden the collection from his own family raised questions about ownership and inheritance rights that Marcus wasn't qualified to navigate on his own. The sun was beginning to sink behind the mountains, and the afternoon air was growing colder. Marcus wrapped the metal box carefully in his jacket and began walking back toward town, his mind racing with possibilities and questions. He needed to find somewhere secure to store his discovery while he figured out his next steps. And he needed to do some research on precious metals dealers and legal procedures for authenticating valuable finds. Most importantly, he needed to be careful not to let anyone know what he'd found until he understood all the implications and had taken steps to protect both himself and his newfound fortune. Cedar Falls was a small town where news traveled fast, and the sudden appearance of wealth in the hands of a homeless man would certainly attract attention from people who might not have his best interests at heart. As Marcus walked through the gathering darkness toward whatever shelter he could find for the night, he carried with him not just a metal box full of precious objects, but the first real hope he'd felt in months that his long slide toward rock bottom might finally be over. The road ahead was uncertain and probably complicated, but for the first time since losing his house, Marcus felt like he had a future worth planning for. The discovery would prove to be even more significant than Marcus imagined that evening, setting in motion a series of events that would not only transform his own life, but ultimately change the entire trajectory of Cedar Falls itself. But that was still to come. And for now, Marcus Williams walked through the cold Montana night as a homeless man carrying a fortune, not yet understanding that he held in his hands the key to bringing prosperity back to a town that had almost forgotten what prosperity looked like. Marcus spent his first night as a secret millionaire in the abandoned Sinclair gas station on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, clutching the metal box against his chest like a lifeline. Sleep came in fragments between moments of panic, where he'd wake up convinced the entire discovery had been an elaborate dream. Each time, his fingers would find the cool steel surface of the container, confirming that his life had indeed taken an impossible turn. By dawn, Marcus had developed a plan. He needed 3 things immediately: expert authentication of the collections, value, legal advice about ownership rights, and a secure place to store his discovery while he sorted everything out. The nearest city with the resources he required was Billings, about 2 hours away by bus, assuming the Greyhound still ran the morning route through Cedar Falls. The bus station occupied a corner of Mel's Diner, where a handwritten schedule taped to the window showed departures to Billings at 7:45 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. daily. Marcus arrived at 7:30 with the metal box wrapped in a trash bag and stuffed into a worn backpack he'd borrowed from Dale Crawford. To anyone watching, he looked like just another transient leaving town with his meager possessions. Helen Rodriguez, the diner owner who also served as the unofficial bus agent, sold him a round-trip ticket for $38, leaving Marcus with exactly 73 cents in pocket change. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now technically broke again, despite carrying what might be a fortune on his back. The bus was nearly empty. Just Marcus, an elderly woman visiting her daughter in Billings, and a traveling salesman who spent the journey making phone calls about agricultural equipment. Marcus stared out the window at the Montana landscape rolling past, trying to wrap his mind around how dramatically his circumstances had changed in less than 24 hours. Billings felt overwhelming after months in Cedar Falls. The traffic, the noise, the sheer number of people moving with purpose along the sidewalks. It reminded Marcus how isolated he'd become in his small-town existence. He walked several blocks from the bus terminal before finding what he was looking for: Frontier Precious Metals, a shop advertising coin and jewelry appraisal services. The owner, David Chen, was a soft-spoken man in his 50s who examined Marcus with curious but non-judgmental eyes. Marcus had rehearsed his story during the bus ride. He'd inherited some items from a deceased relative and wanted to know if they had any value. It was close enough to the truth to feel comfortable. Chen led Marcus to a back room equipped with scales, magnifying equipment, and reference books. When Marcus unwrapped the first coin, Chen's demeanor immediately shifted from polite interest to intense focus. "Where exactly did you acquire this?" Chen asked, adjusting his jeweler's loupe to examine the coin more closely. "Family inheritance," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "My great-uncle was a collector." Chen spent the next hour examining each item in the collection with methodical precision. He weighed the coins, tested the gold bars with acid solutions, and used an electronic device to verify the gemstone's authenticity. His occasional murmurs of remarkable and extraordinary condition made Marcus increasingly nervous. Finally, Chen sat back and removed his loupe. "Young man, what you have here is genuinely exceptional. These Roman coins are authentic pieces from the Antonine period, probably worth 15,000 to 20,000 each to the right collector. The Spanish colonial pieces are equally rare, and the American eagles are in uncirculated condition, which makes them extremely valuable." Marcus felt dizzy. "How valuable?" "The coins alone, conservatively, are worth between $400,000 and $500,000. The gemstones would need more specialized evaluation, but I'd estimate another 200,000 to 300,000. The gold bars are worth about 20,000 at current market prices." Chen paused, studying Marcus's face. "Your great-uncle had exceptional taste and knowledge." Marcus nodded mutely, afraid to speak and reveal how completely unprepared he was for this information. "However," Chen continued, "I have to ask about provenance. Items of this caliber typically come with documentation, certificates of authenticity, purchase records. Collectors at this level keep meticulous records." Marcus pulled out Robert Henderson's handwritten inventory. Chen examined it carefully, comparing the descriptions to the actual items. "This helps, but for items of this value, you'll want formal appraisals from certified specialists. I can provide preliminary documentation for insurance purposes, but if you're planning to sell any of these pieces, buyers will expect more comprehensive authentication." Chen provided Marcus with a written preliminary appraisal totaling the collection's value at approximately $750,000, along with recommendations for specialists in numismatics and gemology. He also suggested consulting with an attorney about tax implications and estate documentation. Walking back toward the bus terminal, Marcus felt as if he were floating several inches off the sidewalk. $750,000. Even accounting for taxes and fees, it was more money than he'd ever imagined having. It was enough to buy a house, start a business, and ensure he'd never be homeless again. It was enough to help other people in Cedar Falls who were struggling. It was enough to matter. The return bus didn't leave until 2:30, giving Marcus several hours to kill in Billings. He used the time to visit the public library, where he researched precious metals dealers, estate, law, and tax regulations for inherited valuables. The more he learned, the more complex his situation appeared to be. Legally, the collection seemed to belong to him through legitimate purchase at the estate sale. Robert Henderson's note suggested he'd hidden it from his family, which might explain why it hadn't been properly inventoried when the estate was prepared for sale. However, Marcus realized he needed proper legal advice to ensure he was protected from any future claims. He also discovered that converting the collection to cash would be more complicated than simply walking into a dealer and asking for money. Rare coins and gems typically sold at auction or to specialized collectors, processes that could take months. Even then, he'd face significant capital gains taxes on the difference between his purchase price and the sale value. By the time Marcus boarded the afternoon bus back to Cedar Falls, His initial euphoria had been tempered by the realization that his discovery, while extraordinary, came with substantial complications. He was wealthy on paper, but practically speaking, he was still a homeless man with 73 cents in his pocket and nowhere to sleep that night. The bus pulled into Cedar Falls just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. Marcus walked back toward town, carrying his backpack with the same careful attention he'd used that morning, acutely aware that he was transporting more value than most people earned in a lifetime. Cedar Falls looked different somehow, though. Marcus couldn't immediately identify what had changed. The same empty storefronts lined Main Street, the same handful of residents went about their evening routines, but Marcus now saw the town through the lens of possibility rather than decline. $750,000 was enough to make a real difference here, to invest in businesses or properties that could help reverse the economic spiral that had claimed so many lives and dreams. He stopped at the Salvation Army office, hoping to catch Patricia Williams before she closed for the day. She was locking up as he approached, but she smiled when she recognized him. "Marcus, how did the Henderson sale go? Find anything interesting?" "Just some old junk," Marcus replied, which was technically accurate if profoundly misleading. "Patricia, I've been thinking about something. If someone wanted to start a business in Cedar Falls, what would you think the town needs most?" Patricia considered the question seriously. "Honestly, we need everything. A decent grocery store, since Morrison's has such limited selection. Maybe a hardware store, since Harriman's is talking about retiring. Really, we need something that would give people reasons to stay instead of reasons to leave." "What about jobs? What kind of business would employ the most people?" "Manufacturing, if you could find something that made sense to produce here. Or maybe a call center, something that could hire folks with different skill levels." "Why do you ask?" Marcus shrugged. "Just curious about what it would take to turn things around." Patricia locked the office door and turned to face him. "Marcus, are you thinking about starting something? Because if you are, I have to tell you it's not easy. The bank isn't exactly eager to lend money for new ventures here, and the infrastructure needs work. But if you're serious about it, I know some people who might be able to help with planning and permits." "I'm just in the thinking stage," Marcus said. "But if I did want to explore it, who would I talk to?" "Mayor Davidson would be your first stop. He's been trying to attract new business for years. Also, there's a regional development office in Billings that helps with small business loans and economic development grants." Marcus thanked Patricia and watched her drive away in her ancient Toyota. The idea of revealing his discovery to local officials made him nervous, but he realized he'd need allies if he wanted to do something meaningful with his newfound wealth. That evening he made his way to the Methodist Church, where Pastor Michael Reynolds ran a weekly dinner for anyone who needed a meal. Marcus had attended several times, appreciating both the food and the pastor's no-questions-asked approach to helping people. The church basement was warm and filled with the smell of pot roast and fresh bread. About 20 people were gathered. Around folding tables, including several faces Marcus recognized from his months on the streets. Jenny Morrison was there, along with Dale Crawford and Tommy Chen. There were also families he didn't know well, people who worked but still struggled to put enough food on their tables. Pastor Reynolds was a man in his early 40s who'd come to Cedar Falls 5 years ago with ideas about community outreach and social justice. He'd grown up in Detroit and understood urban poverty, but small-town economic collapse presented different challenges that required different solutions. "Marcus," Pastor Reynolds called out when he spotted him. "Haven't seen you in a while. How are things going?" "Getting better, I hope," Marcus replied, accepting a plate of food and finding a seat at one of the tables. As Marcus ate, he listened to the conversations around him. People talked about job searches, health problems, children who were moving, a way for better opportunities. elderly parents who needed care but couldn't afford proper assistance. It was a catalogue of the problems facing small-town America, problems that money alone couldn't solve, but that money could certainly help address. After dinner, Marcus approached Pastor Reynolds privately. "Pastor, if someone wanted to make a significant donation to help people in Cedar Falls, what would be the most effective way to do it?" Pastor Reynolds looked surprised. "That's a wonderful thought, Marcus. Are we talking about a specific amount or just general guidance? Let's say it was substantial enough to make a real difference. Maybe start some programs, help people get back on their feet." Well, there are several approaches. Direct assistance is always needed. Help with rent, utilities, medical bills, things like that. But longer-term job creation has the biggest impact. If someone could start a business that employed even 20 or 30 people, it would transform the local economy. What about education or training programs? Those are excellent too. A lot of folks here have skills but need retraining for modern jobs. Computer literacy, updated technical training, even basic business skills for people who want to start their own ventures. Pastor Reynolds studied Marcus with curious eyes. "Marcus, forgive me for asking, but are you thinking about this for personal reasons? Because if you've come into some money somehow, I want to make sure you get good advice about managing it." Marcus hesitated. Pastor Reynolds had been nothing but kind to him, and Marcus felt the urge to confide in someone about his discovery. But he wasn't ready to reveal the truth, not until he'd figured out the legal and practical implications. "Just planning ahead," Marcus said. "Sometimes it helps to think about what you'd do if circumstances changed." After leaving the church, Marcus walked through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, past the empty storefronts and the houses where families were struggling to make ends meet. The weight of the metal box in his backpack felt heavier now, not because of its physical mass, but because of the responsibility it represented. He'd spent months feeling helpless, watching his own life spiral downward while being unable to effect any meaningful change. Now he had the resources to make a difference, not just for himself, but for an entire community. The question was how to do it responsibly, legally, and effectively. Marcus found shelter that night in the old Ford dealership building, which had been empty since the business closed 3 years earlier. The building still had running water and electricity, thanks to Dale Crawford's knowledge of which utilities hadn't been completely shut off in abandoned buildings. It wasn't comfortable, but it was private and secure. Important considerations for someone carrying $750,000 in precious metals. As he settled into his sleeping bag on the concrete floor of the former showroom, Marcus made mental lists of everything he needed to accomplish. Legal consultation to ensure his ownership was secure, professional appraisals to establish definitive values, a plan for converting some portion of the collection to cash, and most importantly, a strategy for using his newfound wealth to help rebuild the community that had been his home for 32 years. Outside, snow began falling again, dusting the empty streets and abandoned buildings of Cedar Falls with a layer of white that made everything look clean and hopeful. Marcus watched through the large windows that had once displayed new Ford trucks and sedans, imagining a future where those windows might showcase thriving businesses again, where the streets might be busy with people who had reasons to stay and reasons to hope. The discovery of Robert Henderson's collection had given Marcus more than money. It had given him purpose. Tomorrow, he would begin the complex process of transforming a rusted metal box full of precious objects into the foundation for something much more valuable. A second chance for a town that had almost forgotten what second chances looked like. Marcus woke before dawn in the abandoned Ford dealership, his breath visible in the cold air that had settled overnight. The heating system had been disconnected years ago, And even with the building's protection from wind, the Montana winter found ways to seep through broken seals and cracked foundations. But for the first time in months, the physical discomfort didn't dominate his thoughts. Instead, his mind buzzed with plans and possibilities that had seemed impossible just days earlier. He'd made a decision during the long, wakeful hours before sunrise. Rather than trying to liquidate the entire collection immediately, he would sell just enough pieces to establish himself legally and financially, then use those proceeds to begin investing in Cedar Falls while keeping the most valuable items secure for the future. It was a conservative approach, but Marcus had learned through bitter experience that moving too quickly often led to mistakes he couldn't afford. The first piece he'd chosen to sell was one of the Roman gold coins, a particularly fine specimen that David Chen had estimated at $18,000 to $20,000. It wasn't the most valuable item in the collection, but it was significant enough to provide the capital Marcus needed for his immediate goals, while representing only a small fraction of his total wealth. Marcus packed the metal box carefully into his backpack, along with the documentation David Chen had provided. Today would require another trip to Billings, but this time with a more specific purpose, finding a reputable auction house or dealer who could handle the sale of a museum-quality Roman coin. The morning bus was more crowded than the previous days had been, filled with commuters heading to jobs in the bigger city. Marcus found a seat near the back and spent the journey reviewing notes he'd made about numismatic dealers and auction procedures. The research had revealed that selling rare coins required patience. The best prices came from specialized auctions, where serious collectors competed for exceptional pieces. But those auctions happened quarterly and required months of advance planning. However, Marcus had also learned about a network of established dealers who bought high-quality pieces for their own inventory, offering immediate payment at slightly below auction prices. For someone in his situation, the trade-off between maximum value and immediate liquidity made sense. Heritage Numismatics occupied a discreet office building in downtown Billings, its modest exterior giving no indication of the valuable transactions conducted inside. Marcus had called ahead, speaking with a receptionist who'd scheduled him for an appointment with senior partner Elizabeth Morrison, no relation to Jenny Morrison from Cedar Falls, though the coincidence made Marcus smile. Elizabeth Morrison was a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair, and the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of handling valuable objects. Her office walls were lined with framed certificates and photographs of rare coins, including several pieces that had sold for six-figure sums at major auctions. "Mr. Williams," she said, gesturing for Marcus to take a seat across from her desk, "you mentioned on the phone that you have a Roman coin you'd like to evaluate for possible purchase." Marcus unwrapped the coin carefully, placing it on a velvet pad that Morrison had prepared. She examined it first with the naked eye, then under magnification, occasionally making soft sounds of appreciation. "This is a particularly fine example," she said finally. "Antoninus Pius, struck in Rome around 145 AD. The condition is remarkable. I'd grade it as nearly uncirculated, which is extraordinary for a coin of this age." She looked up at Marcus. "May I ask where you acquired it?" Marcus repeated his inheritance story, which was becoming more comfortable with practice. Morrison nodded and continued her examination. "The provenance documentation you've provided is helpful, though for a piece of this caliber, buyers typically prefer more detailed records. However, the coin's authenticity is clear, and the condition speaks for itself." She set down her loupe and looked directly at Marcus. "I'd be prepared to offer $17,000 for immediate purchase, or I could arrange for it to be included in our next quarterly auction, which would likely yield $20,000 to $25,000, but wouldn't occur until April." $17,000 represented more money than Marcus had earned in the past year, and the prospect of having it immediately available was compelling. But something in Morrison's tone suggested there might be room for negotiation. "What if I had additional pieces from the same collection?" Marcus asked. "Would that affect your evaluation of this particular coin?" Morrison's eyes sharpened with interest. "It could, depending on what else you have. Collections with documented history and consistent quality often command premiums, especially if the pieces complement each other historically or aesthetically." Marcus had come prepared for this possibility. From his backpack, he withdrew one of the Spanish colonial coins and one of the American gold eagles, both wrapped in tissue paper and accompanied by documentation from the Henderson inventory. Morrison's professional composure wavered slightly as she examined the additional pieces. The Spanish coin bore the coat of arms of King Philip IV and dated to 1652, while the American eagle was an 1884 specimen in pristine condition. "Mr. Williams," Morrison said carefully, "these pieces suggest a collection of exceptional breadth and quality. If you have additional items of this caliber, we should discuss a more comprehensive arrangement." "I'm not ready to sell everything," Marcus replied, "but I am interested in establishing a working relationship with a dealer who understands the collection's value and can help me make informed decisions about individual pieces." Morrison nodded approvingly. "That's a wise approach. Collections of this quality should be handled strategically, not liquidated hastily." She paused, clearly calculating. "For these 3 pieces purchased together, I could offer $55,000. The combination premium, plus the quality of your documentation, justifies the higher price." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. $55,000 would provide enough capital to begin serious investments in Cedar Falls while leaving the bulk of his collection intact. More importantly, establishing a relationship with Heritage Numismatics would give him access to professional guidance for future transactions. "I accept," he said, hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt. The paperwork took nearly 2 hours. Morrison insisted on detailed documentation for tax purposes, including photographs of each coin and sworn statements about their acquisition. She also provided Marcus with contact information for other specialists who could help with the gemstones and additional gold pieces if he decided to sell more items in the future. Walking out of Heritage Numismatics with a cashier's check for $55,000 felt surreal. Marcus had to resist the urge to pull the check from his pocket repeatedly to confirm it was real. Instead, he walked directly to the First National Bank of Montana, where he opened a business checking account under his name and deposited the check. The bank manager, a pleasant woman named Sarah Kim, helped Marcus understand the implications of his sudden deposit. The money would be held for several business days while the cashier's check cleared, but once available, he'd have full access to the funds. She also suggested that he might want to consult with a financial advisor about investment strategies and tax planning, given the substantial nature of the transaction. Marcus thanked her and left the bank with temporary checks and a debit card that would be activated within 24 hours. For the first time in months, he had legitimate identification that showed a real address. The bank had accepted general delivery, Cedar Falls as his mailing address, and proof of substantial financial resources. His next stop was the office of Carver and Associates, a law firm that specialized in estate planning and small business development. Marcus had researched the firm online and been impressed by their experience with both individual clients and economic development projects. Attorney James Carver was a man in his early 50s who'd grown up in small-town Montana before attending law school at the University of Colorado. He understood the economic challenges facing rural communities and had helped several clients navigate the complexities of inheritance law and business formation. Marcus explained his situation more completely to Carver than he had to anyone else, including the discovery of the Henderson collection, its authentication and partial sale, and his plans to invest in Cedar Falls economic development. Carver listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "First," Carver said when Marcus finished, "congratulations on handling this discovery responsibly. Many people in your situation would have made costly mistakes by moving too quickly or failing to document everything properly." He outlined the legal framework Marcus needed to understand. The collection was legally his through legitimate purchase, and Robert Henderson's note actually strengthened his claim by demonstrating that the items had been intentionally concealed from the estate inventory. However, Carver recommended obtaining formal statements from the estate sale company and any witnesses to the purchase, just to protect against any future challenges. "Regarding your plans for Cedar Falls," Carver continued, "there are several business structures that would make sense depending on your goals. If you want to invest in existing businesses, a limited liability company would provide flexibility and tax advantages. If you're thinking about real estate development, we might want to consider a more complex structure that could attract additional investors." Marcus had been thinking about this during the bus ride. "What if I wanted to do multiple things? Buy some properties, start a business, maybe establish some kind of community development fund?" "That's ambitious, but certainly possible. We could create an umbrella organization with subsidiary entities for different purposes. It would require careful planning, but it could provide significant tax benefits while allowing you to pursue multiple strategies simultaneously." Carver explained the basics of business formation, municipal regulations, and the various permits and licenses that different ventures would require. He also discussed the importance of establishing a clear business plan and maintaining proper records for both legal and tax purposes. "One more thing," Carver added. "Given the nature of your discovery and your plans for community investment, you'll want to consider liability protection very carefully. Success in small-town economic development often attracts both praise and criticism, and you want to ensure your personal assets are protected from potential legal challenges." Marcus left Carver's office with a detailed action plan and an appointment to return the following week to begin formal business formation. The legal consultation had cost him $800, but it felt like money well spent. For the first time since his discovery, Marcus had a clear roadmap for transforming his find into meaningful action. The afternoon bus back to Cedar Falls was nearly empty, giving Marcus time to organize his thoughts and plan his next moves. He now had the financial resources and legal framework to begin serious investments, but he still needed to decide exactly how to proceed. Moving too quickly could attract unwanted attention, while moving too slowly might mean missing opportunities to help people who needed assistance immediately. As the bus wound through the Montana landscape towards Cedar Falls, Marcus made a mental list of his immediate priorities. He needed a place to live, both for practical reasons and to establish legitimate residency for business purposes. He wanted to begin identifying specific investment opportunities that could create jobs and attract other businesses to the area. And he needed to start building relationships with local officials and community leaders who could help guide his efforts effectively. The bus pulled into Cedar Falls just as the streetlights were coming on, illuminating the same empty storefronts and quiet streets that Marcus had been walking for months. But now he saw them differently, not as symbols of defeat, but as opportunities waiting for the right investment and vision. He walked toward downtown, carrying his backpack with its reduced but still substantial treasure, thinking about the conversation he'd need to have with Mayor Davidson and the plans he'd need to develop for putting his newfound resources to work. Tomorrow, he will begin the process of transforming from a homeless man with a secret into a legitimate businessman, with the power to change his community's future. The next morning marked the beginning of Marcus's transformation from invisible homeless man to legitimate community member. His first stop was Anderson's clothing store, one of the few retail establishments still operating on Main Street. Marcus needed professional attire for his upcoming meetings with Mayor Davidson and other local officials, but he also wanted to make his first purchase as someone with actual spending power from a local business that needed the revenue. Frank Anderson was a man in his late 60s who'd run the clothing store for 37 years, watching it slowly decline as residents either left town or drove to Billings for shopping. When Marcus walked in, asking for a complete business wardrobe, Anderson's eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for unexpected windfalls. "Haven't seen you in here before," Anderson said, leading Marcus toward the suits section. "Are you new to Cedar Falls, or just new to wearing suits?" Marcus smiled at the question's directness. "I've been in town a while, but my circumstances have changed recently. I'm starting a business and need to look the part." Anderson measured Marcus carefully and selected several options from his limited but quality inventory. A charcoal gray suit that fit well with minimal alterations, 2 dress shirts, a conservative tie, and leather shoes that actually matched. The total came to $430, which Marcus paid in cash from the advance the bank had given him on his pending deposit. "What kind of business are you planning to start?" Anderson asked as he marked the suit jacket for alterations. "Community development," Marcus replied. "I think Cedar Falls has potential that hasn't been fully realized." Anderson paused in his marking. "Son, I've been here nearly 4 decades, and I've heard that kind of talk before. Usually from people who don't understand how deep the problems go." He studied Marcus with curiosity. "But I hope you're different. This town could use someone who actually follows through on their promises." The suit alterations would be ready by afternoon, giving Marcus time for his next priority: finding proper housing. He'd spent his last night sleeping rough, but that phase of his life was ending, both for practical reasons and for credibility with potential business partners. He needed a legitimate address. Cedar Falls had limited rental options, most of them concentrated in a few apartment buildings constructed during the town's more prosperous decades. Marcus walked through the residential neighborhoods, looking for rent signs and getting a sense of property values and neighborhood dynamics. He found what he was looking for on Elm Street, a small but well-maintained house with a "for rent" sign in the front yard. The house was a 1950s bungalow with 2 bedrooms, a single bathroom, and a kitchen that looked recently updated. More importantly, it had a detached garage that could serve as workshop space and a fenced yard that provided privacy. The property manager was Linda Foster, a real estate agent who handled rentals for several property owners in town. She met Marcus at the house within an hour of his call, clearly eager to show the property to a potential tenant. "It's been empty for 3 months, Foster admitted as she unlocked the front door. "The rental market here isn't exactly booming. Most people who can afford to rent their own place end up leaving town for better job opportunities." The house was perfect for Marcus's immediate needs. It was clean, furnished with basic items, and available immediately. The rent was $800 per month, which seemed reasonable given the local market conditions. "I'll take it," Marcus said, pulling out his temporary checkbook. "I can pay the first month, last month, and the security deposit today." Foster looked surprised by his decisiveness. "Don't you want to think about it? Check out other options." "This meets my needs," Marcus replied, writing a check for $2,400. "I prefer to make decisions quickly when I find what I'm looking for." By noon, Marcus had keys to his first legitimate address in nearly a year. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. He was no longer homeless, no longer without resources or options. the house was more than shelter. It was a foundation for everything he planned to build. His altered suit was ready at 2 o'clock, and Marcus changed into it at Anderson's store, emerging as a completely different person than the one who'd entered that morning. The transformation wasn't just physical, though the well-fitted clothing certainly helped. It was the confidence that came from having resources, plans, and legitimate standing in the community. Marcus's appointment with Mayor Davidson was scheduled for 3 o'clock at City Hall, a modest brick building that housed the mayor's office, the city clerk, and the small staff that ran Cedar Falls municipal operations. The building showed its age and the city's budget constraints. Fluorescent lights flickered in the hallways, and the carpet was worn thin from decades of use. Mayor Robert Davidson was a man in his early 50s who'd been elected 2 years earlier, on a platform of economic development and fiscal responsibility. He'd grown up in Cedar Falls, left for college and a career in state government, then returned when his aging parents needed care. His decision to run for mayor had been motivated by frustration with the city's decline and a belief that proper leadership could attract new investment. "Mr. Williams," Davidson said, standing to shake hands when Marcus entered his office. "Linda Foster called and mentioned you'd rented the house on Elm Street. Planning to stay in Cedar Falls long term." "That's my intention," Marcus replied, taking a seat across from Davidson's desk. "I'm interested in discussing some business development opportunities that might benefit both my interests and the city's economic goals." Davidson leaned forward with obvious interest. Cedar Falls received few inquiries from potential investors, and fewer still from people who seemed to have actual resources behind their intentions. Marcus had prepared carefully for this conversation. Rather than revealing the full extent of his newfound wealth, he positioned himself as someone who'd recently received a moderate inheritance and wanted to invest in small-town opportunities. It was truthful without being complete, and it explained his financial capabilities without raising questions about their source. "What kind of developments are you considering?" Davidson asked. "Several possibilities," Marcus replied. "I'm particularly interested in properties that could house multiple businesses, maybe convert some of the empty buildings downtown into spaces suitable for retail, offices, or light manufacturing. I'm also looking at residential properties that could be renovated and either rented or sold to attract new residents." Davidson's eyes lit up. This was exactly the kind of conversation he'd hoped to have since taking office, but opportunities had been few and far between. "We've got plenty of available properties," Davidson said, pulling out a folder of documents. "The city actually owns several buildings through tax foreclosure proceedings, and we'd be eager to work with someone who has serious development plans." He spread out photographs and property descriptions across his desk. There was the old Woolworths building on Main Street, a 2-story structure with good bones but in need of significant renovation. The former movie theater, which had been closed for 8 years, but retained its vintage charm and could potentially be restored as an entertainment venue. Several residential properties in various states of repair, from move-in, ready to requiring complete rehabilitation. "What kind of incentives does the city offer for development projects?" Marcus asked. Davidson explained the various programs available through both city and county governments. Property tax abatements for businesses that created jobs, low interest, loans through state economic development programs, and fast-track permitting for projects that met certain criteria. The challenge hadn't been lack of incentives, it had been lack of investors with the resources and commitment to take advantage of them. "There's one more thing you should know," Davidson continued. "We've been working with a regional development organization on a comprehensive economic plan for the county. They're looking for anchor investments that could catalyze broader development. If your projects fit their criteria, there might be additional grant funding available." Marcus asked, Detailed questions about zoning regulations, building codes, and the approval processes for different types of developments. Davidson answered thoroughly, clearly hoping that this potential investor was different from the others who'd expressed interest over the years, but never followed through with concrete action. "I'd like to schedule some property tours," Marcus said finally, "and I'd appreciate introductions to key people I should know, the building inspector, planning commission members, other business owners who might have insights about what the community needs most." Davidson nodded eagerly. "I can set up a comprehensive tour for tomorrow afternoon, and there's a Chamber of Commerce meeting next Thursday evening. It's mostly the remaining business owners, but it would be a good opportunity to meet people and get their perspectives." As Marcus left City Hall, he felt energized by the possibilities Davidson had outlined. The mayor's enthusiasm was encouraging, but more importantly, the meeting had revealed specific opportunities that aligned with Marcus's resources and goals. The city-owned properties represented immediate possibilities, while the regional development programs could provide leverage to multiply his impact. His next stop was the Cedar Falls Public Library, a Carnegie library built in 1912 that remained one of the most beautiful buildings in town. Librarian Margaret Torres had been fighting budget cuts for years, keeping the library open through a combination of volunteer help and creative fundraising. The building needed repairs and the collection needed updating, but it remained a vital community resource. Marcus spent 2 hours at the library researching the properties Davidson had shown him, looking up ownership histories, tax assessments, and building permits. He also researched comparable development projects in other small Montana towns, trying to understand what had worked elsewhere and what had failed. The research revealed both opportunities and challenges. Several towns similar to Cedar Falls had successfully attracted new businesses and residents through strategic property development and business recruitment. However, the failures outnumbered the successes, often due to inadequate funding, unrealistic timelines, or insufficient community support. By evening, Marcus had developed a preliminary strategy for his first investments. Rather than trying to tackle multiple large projects simultaneously, he would focus on 2 specific opportunities: renovating the Woolworths building into a mixed-use space for retail and offices, and purchasing several residential properties for renovation and resale to attract new residents. He spent his first night in his rented house making detailed plans and calculating budgets. The Woolworths renovation would probably cost between $40,000 and $60,000, assuming the building structure was sound. The residential properties would require varying levels of investment, but even major renovations rarely exceeded $20,000 per house in the local market. With $55,000 already available and the remainder of his collection providing additional resources, Marcus had more than enough capital for his initial investments. More importantly, he had a clear strategy for creating visible improvements that could build community confidence and attract other investors. As he settled into bed in his first real bedroom in nearly a year, Marcus reflected on how completely his life had changed in less than a week. The discovery of Robert Henderson's collection had provided the financial resources, but the real transformation was in his sense of purpose and possibility. He was no longer someone to whom things happened. He was someone who could make things happen. Tomorrow would bring property tours, more detailed planning, and the beginning of his transition from homeless man with a secret to community developer. With the power to change Cedar Falls' future, the foundation had been laid. Now the real work of building could begin. The property tour with Mayor Davidson began at 8 o'clock the next morning, starting with the old Woolworths building that dominated a full block of Main Street. The structure dated to 1923 and had been the retail heart of Cedar Falls during its prosperous decades. Now it stood empty, its large windows covered with plywood and weeds growing through cracks in the sidewalk. Building Inspector Carl Hoffman met them at the front entrance, carrying a clipboard thick with inspection reports and violation notices accumulated over the years since Woolworths had closed. Hoffman was a meticulous man in his early 60s who'd overseen construction projects throughout the region and understood both the potential and pitfalls of historic building renovation. "Structurally, she's solid," Hoffman said as they entered. The cavernous main floor. Good brick construction, steel beam supports, concrete foundation that's held up well. The roof needs work, and all the electrical and plumbing systems are decades out of code, but the bones are excellent. Marcus walked through the space, visualizing possibilities. The main floor was nearly 4,000 square feet of open retail space, with high ceilings and large windows that would flood the area with natural light once the plywood was removed. A wide staircase led to a second floor that had once housed the store's offices and stockrooms. "What's the square footage upstairs?" Marcus asked. "About 3,500 square feet, Davidson replied. "It's configured as offices and smaller rooms, but the layout could be modified pretty easily. The previous owner had plans drawn up for converting it to apartments, but the financing fell through." Marcus climbed the stairs, examining the second floor's layout and condition. The space had been neglected but wasn't damaged beyond repair. With proper renovation, it could house professional offices, a community meeting space, or even residential units if zoning permitted. "What would it take to bring this building up to current codes?" Marcus asked Hoffman. The inspector consulted his clipboard. "The electrical system needs complete replacement. Figure 20,000 for that. Plumbing is mostly functional, but needs updates for accessibility compliance. Another 8 to 10,000. The HVAC system is short, needs full replacement for a building this size. 15 to 20,000. Roof repairs, maybe 5,000 if the underlying structure is sound." Davidson added, "The city would fast-track permits for a comprehensive renovation project. We've also got a historic preservation grant program that could cover up to $15,000 in eligible improvements." As they toured the building, Marcus noticed details that revealed its former grandeur. Original hardwood floors beneath layers of worn linoleum, ornate tin ceiling tiles that had been painted over but could be restored, and solid oak trim around windows and doorways. The building had been built to last, and with proper investment, it could anchor downtown revitalization for decades to come. The next stop was the former Rialto Theatre on 2nd Street. The theatre had been built in 1941 and had served as Cedar Falls' primary entertainment venue until cable television and video rentals made small-town movie theatres economically unviable. The building had been closed since 2017, but the original Art Deco facade remained intact, and the interior still contained most of its vintage fixtures. "This is my personal favorite," Davidson admitted as they entered through the lobby. "There's something magical about the idea of bringing live entertainment back to Cedar Falls." The theater's main auditorium seated 280 people and retained its original red velvet seats, though many needed reupholstering. The stage was small but functional, and the projection booth contained equipment that hadn't been updated since the 1980s. Marcus could envision the space hosting live theater, concerts, community events, and perhaps even art films that would attract visitors from surrounding towns. "What's the ownership situation?" Marcus asked. "The family that inherited it wants to sell," Davidson replied. "They've been asking $35,000, but they'd probably negotiate for a serious buyer." With restoration plans, Marcus spent an hour examining the theater's infrastructure. The building's electrical system was more recent than the Woolworths, and the plumbing was adequate for current needs. The biggest expenses would be updating the sound and projection systems, refurbishing the seating, and bringing the stage up to modern performance standards. The residential properties they toured next represented a different type of opportunity. There were 7 houses scattered throughout Cedar Falls that the city had acquired through tax foreclosure, ranging from minor fixer-uppers to properties requiring extensive rehabilitation. Marcus was particularly interested in 3 houses on Pine Street that formed a cluster. Renovating them simultaneously could create a pocket of revitalized residential property that might attract other homeowners too. Invest in improvements. The best of the Pine Street houses was a 1960s ranch that needed mainly cosmetic updates: paint, flooring, kitchen appliances, and landscaping. The worst was a 1940s bungalow with foundation issues and a roof that had been leaking for years. Between them sat a 2-story farmhouse from the 1920s that had good bones but required updating throughout. "What kind of prices are we talking about for these properties?" Marcus asked. Davidson consulted his notes. The city would sell them at assessed value, which ranges from $8,000 to $15,000 per house, but there's flexibility for buyers who commit to renovation and occupancy requirements. As they drove between properties, Marcus questioned Davidson about the community's greatest needs and concerns. The mayor was frank about the challenges facing Cedar Falls: an aging population, limited job opportunities, inadequate internet infrastructure, and a general sense of resignation among residents who'd watched their town decline for decades. "The hardest part is convincing people that things can actually get better," Davidson said. "We've had false starts before. Developers who made big promises then disappeared when they realized how much work was actually involved. People have gotten skeptical about anyone offering easy solutions." Marcus understood that skepticism. He'd been part of the community long enough to see other well-intentioned efforts fail, and he knew that actions would matter more than words in building credibility. That afternoon, Marcus met with Patricia Williams at the Salvation Army office to discuss his ideas for community development. He decided to reveal his plans gradually, starting with people who'd been helpful during his months of homelessness and building outward to include the broader community. "I've come into some money," Marcus explained, "and I want to use it to help turn Cedar Falls around. I'm thinking about buying some properties, starting some businesses, maybe creating some jobs for people who need them." Patricia studied him with curiosity and caution. "Marcus, that's wonderful if it's real, but I have to ask, where did this money come from? Because if you're thinking about taking on debt or getting involved in something that's not legitimate, I'd rather know now than watch you get hurt later." Marcus appreciated her directness. "It's an inheritance situation. Complicated, but completely legal. I've been working with lawyers and banks in Billings to make sure everything is handled properly." He outlined his preliminary plans: renovating the Woolworths building as a mixed-use space, possibly restoring the theater as a community venue, and rehabilitating several residential properties to attract new residents. Patricia listened with growing excitement, asking practical questions about timelines, job creation, and community involvement. "The people who come here for help, a lot of them have skills that aren't being used," Patricia said. "Construction. Workers, electricians, mechanics, people who just need opportunities to get back on their feet. If you're serious about renovation projects, you could provide jobs for folks who really need them while getting quality work done." This aligned perfectly with Marcus's thinking. Rather than hiring contractors from Billings or other larger cities, he wanted to employ local people whenever possible, both to support the community and to ensure that his investment dollars stayed within the local economy. Patricia suggested organizing a community meeting where Marcus could present his ideas and gather input from residents about their priorities and concerns. "People need to feel like they're part of the solution," she said. "If you just show up and start making changes without involving the community, you'll get resistance even if your ideas are good." That evening, Marcus attended his first Chamber of Commerce meeting in the conference room of the First National Bank building. The attendance was modest. 12 business owners and professionals who represented most of Cedar Falls' remaining commercial activity. Marcus recognized several faces: Frank Anderson from the clothing store, Margaret Torres from the library, Dr. Susan Rodriguez, who ran the town's only medical clinic, and others he'd seen around town during his months of homelessness. Chamber President Nancy Walsh, who owned the town's small accounting firm, introduced Marcus as a new resident interested in business development. Marcus stood to address a group, feeling nervous but determined to make a good first impression. "I've recently moved to Cedar Falls with the intention of making it my permanent home," Marcus began. "I've been researching development opportunities, and I believe this community has significant potential that hasn't been fully realized." He outlined his initial investment plans, emphasizing his commitment to hiring locally and involving the community in decision-making processes. The response was cautiously positive, with several members asking detailed questions about his background, financing, and timeline for implementation. Dr. Rodriguez raised a concern that Marcus had anticipated. "We've heard from other developers over the years who had big plans but didn't follow through. What makes you different?" "The only way to answer that is through action," Marcus replied. "I'm planning to start with smaller projects that can be completed quickly and demonstrate concrete results. If those succeed, we can discuss larger initiatives." Frank Anderson spoke up from across the table. "Marcus bought a complete business wardrobe from me yesterday, paid cash, and asked good questions about the local market. That tells me he's at least serious about getting started." The meeting continued for another hour, covering topics from internet infrastructure needs to the possibility of attracting tourism through historic preservation and outdoor recreation marketing. Marcus took notes on community priorities and potential partnership opportunities, building a mental map of how his individual projects might connect to broader economic development goals. As the meeting concluded, several members approached Marcus privately to discuss specific ideas or offer assistance. Margaret Torres suggested that the library could serve as a community information center for development projects. Dr. Rodriguez mentioned that improved housing options might help attract a second physician to serve the growing elderly population in surrounding rural areas. Walking home from the meeting, Marcus felt energized by the community's response. While there was understandable skepticism about his ability to deliver on his promises, there was also genuine hope that his efforts might succeed where others had failed. The key would be following through quickly on his initial commitments while maintaining realistic expectations about what could be accomplished and how quickly. Back at his house on Elm Street, Marcus spread out the property information Davidson had provided and began developing detailed renovation budgets. The Woolworths building represented his biggest single investment opportunity, but also the highest risk. Success with that project would establish his credibility and potentially catalyze other downtown improvements. Failure would not only waste his money, but might discourage other potential investors from taking similar risks. The residential properties offered lower risk and faster returns, both financial and in terms of community impact. Renovated houses would provide immediate housing options for people wanting to move to Cedar Falls, while the rehabilitation process would create construction jobs and demonstrate Marcus's commitment to improving the town's overall appearance. As he worked through the numbers, Marcus realized that his initial $55,000, while substantial, would only cover the beginning phases of his development plans. Success would require either additional sales from his remaining collection or finding ways to leverage his initial investments to attract other funding sources. The regional development programs Davidson had mentioned offered one avenue for stretching his capital. Bank financing was another possibility, now that he had established credit history and collateral. But Marcus preferred to maintain control over his projects rather than taking on partners or lenders who might not share his vision for community-centered development. By midnight, he'd developed a preliminary timeline for his first year of investments. Purchase and begin renovating 3 residential properties within the next month, start the Woolworths building renovation in early spring, and evaluate the theatre project once he'd demonstrated success with the other initiatives. It was an ambitious but achievable plan that would require careful management of both his financial resources and his time. More importantly, it was a plan that could begin immediately, transforming his abstract intentions into concrete actions that would benefit Cedar Falls and its residents. As Marcus prepared for bed in his comfortable house, he reflected on how completely his perspective had changed since discovering the Henderson collection. A week ago, he'd been focused entirely on day-to-day survival. Now, he was planning investments that could reshape an entire community's economic future. The responsibility was daunting, but also energizing in a way he hadn't felt since his college. Geology studies. Tomorrow would bring the next steps in his transformation from homeless man to community developer. Property purchases, contractor meetings, and the beginning of his first renovation project. Marcus woke at 5:30 on Thursday morning with the nervous energy that comes before making irreversible decisions. Today, he would purchase his first properties and hire his first contractors, transforming months of planning into concrete action. His bank account showed $54,000 available. The cashier's check had cleared, and he was no longer operating on borrowed time or temporary funds. His first appointment was at City Hall, where Mayor Davidson had prepared purchase agreements for 3 residential properties, the Pine Street houses that Marcus had identified as his initial renovation targets. The total cost would be $32,000, leaving him with enough capital to begin renovations while maintaining a modest cash reserve for unexpected expenses. City Clerk Maria Santos had worked in municipal government for 15 years and had processed very few property sales during Cedar Falls' decline. She seemed almost excited to handle paperwork for someone actually buying properties rather than abandoning them to tax foreclosure. It's unusual to see someone purchase multiple properties simultaneously, Santos commented as Marcus reviewed the contracts. Most buyers want to test the waters with one property before committing to additional investments. I prefer to work at scale when possible, Marcus replied, signing the documents. Renovating multiple properties in the same neighborhood creates synergy. Each improvement increases the value of the others. Within an hour, Marcus owned 3 houses in various states of disrepair and had established himself as Cedar Falls' most active property investor in recent memory. More importantly, he demonstrated to city officials that his intentions extended beyond preliminary discussions to actual financial commitments. His next stop was Rodriguez Construction, a small family business run by Miguel Rodriguez, Dr. Rodriguez's husband, who specialized in residential renovation and repair work. Rodriguez employed 4 full-time workers and had survived Cedar Falls' economic downturn by traveling to jobs in Billings and other regional cities, but he preferred working locally when projects were available. I understand you're looking at some serious renovation projects, Rodriguez said when Marcus arrived at his workshop behind the family's home on Cedar Street. The space was organized and well-equipped with tools and materials that suggested both competence and attention to quality. Marcus explained his plans for the 3 Pine Street properties, emphasizing his desire to hire locally and complete the work to high standards that would enhance the entire neighborhood. Rodriguez listened carefully, asking practical questions about timelines, budgets, and Marcus's expectations for the finished products. The 1960s ranch shouldn't take more than 3 weeks if we focus on essentials, Rodriguez said. consulting. Notes he'd made during a preliminary inspection. New flooring, interior paint, kitchen appliances, and some landscaping. Maybe $8,000 in materials and labor. The 1920s farmhouse would require more extensive work. The electrical system needed updating, the bathroom required complete renovation, and several windows needed replacement. Rodriguez estimated 6 weeks and $15,000 to bring the property to move-in condition. The 1940s bungalow presented the greatest challenges. Foundation repairs, roof replacement, and extensive interior work would take 2 months and cost nearly $18,000. However, Rodriguez believed the finished product would be worth the investment. This house has original hardwood, floors, built-in cabinetry, and architectural details you don't see anymore, Rodriguez explained. Done right, it could be the nicest house in that neighborhood. Marcus approved all 3 renovation projects, providing Rodriguez with a $10,000 advance to begin purchasing materials. It was satisfying to write checks that would create immediate employment for local workers while improving properties that had been neglected for years. That afternoon, Marcus met with Jenny Morrison at the Coffee Corner, a small cafe that served as one of Cedar Falls's informal community gathering places. Jenny had been surprised by his invitation, but curious about his transformation from homeless companion to apparent businessman. "I heard you bought some houses," Jenny said, settling into a booth with her coffee. "People are talking about it all over town. Some folks think you won the lottery, others figure you're running some kind of scam." Marcus smiled at the predictable range of speculation. "Nothing that dramatic. I came into some money through a family inheritance and I decided to invest it here instead of leaving town like everyone else does." He explained his renovation plans and his longer-term vision for downtown development. Jenny listened with interest, occasionally asking questions about his timeline and his experience with construction projects. "The reason I wanted to talk with you," Marcus said, "is that you know this community better than most people. You understand who needs help and what kinds of help actually make a difference. I'm hoping you might be interested in working with beyond some community outreach aspects of these projects." Jenny raised an eyebrow. "What kind of work are you talking about?" "Connecting people who need jobs with available opportunities, helping coordinate social services for folks who are getting back on their feet, maybe even organizing some kind of housing assistance program for people who want to move into the renovated properties but need help with deposits or moving expenses." Jenny had worked in healthcare before her addiction problems, and she understood both the practical and emotional aspects of helping people navigate difficult transitions. Her own experience with homelessness had given her insights that professional social workers sometimes lacked. "That's interesting work," Jenny said thoughtfully, "but I have to ask, why me? There are people with better credentials and more stable backgrounds." "Because you understand what it's like to be written off by people who think they're better than you," Marcus replied. "And because you've proven you can survive difficult circumstances and still care about helping other people." Jenny considered the offer. Marcus was proposing part-time work that would pay $15 per hour, more than she typically earned from day labor, and with the dignity of using her people skills rather than just her physical capabilities. "I'm interested," she said finally, "but I want to be clear about something. I'm not going to be anyone's token reformed addict. If I do this work, it's because I can actually help people, not because I make you feel good about giving someone a second chance." Marcus respected her directness. "That's exactly why I think you'd be good at this. People need advocates who understand their situations, not just social workers going through the motions." Their conversation was interrupted by Dale Crawford, who'd been watching their meeting with curiosity from across the cafe. He approached their table tentatively, clearly wanting to join the conversation, but uncertain whether he'd be welcome. "Dale, sit down," Marcus said, gesturing to an empty chair. "Actually, I was hoping to talk with you too. Dale settled into the chair, looking surprised by the invitation. Heard you've been making some big moves around town. People are wondering what you're really up to. Marcus explained his development plans again, noting Dale's particular interest in job creation and his concerns about gentrification potentially displacing existing residents. Dale had been homeless longer than any of them and had seen well-intentioned. Programs create unintended consequences for the people they were supposed to help. The thing is, Dale said, improvements are great, but they usually end up pricing out the folks who were getting by before. You fix up all these houses, pretty soon the rents go up and people like us can't afford to live here anymore. It was a legitimate concern that Marcus had been considering. Rising property values could indeed displace existing residents, particularly those with limited incomes. However, he believed that managed properly, development could create opportunities, rather than obstacles for people struggling economically. What if we structured some of the housing specifically for people transitioning out of difficult situations? Marcus suggested. Rent-to-own arrangements or lease agreements that include job training and support services? Dale looked skeptical, but intrigued. That sounds good in theory, but who's going to run programs like that? And what happens when you get tired of playing philanthropist and want to cash out your investments? The questions were pointed, but fair. Marcus realized that his credibility would depend on demonstrating long-term commitment to the community, rather than treating it as a short-term investment opportunity. I can't prove my intentions except through actions, Marcus said. But I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not looking to get rich quick. I grew up here, and I want to see Cedar Falls succeed as a community that takes care of its people. After Dale left, Jenny remained at the table, studying Marcus with renewed interest. He's right to be suspicious, you know. People with money usually have agendas that don't include folks like us, except as charity cases or photo opportunities. What would convince you that I'm different? Marcus asked. Time, Jenny replied, and following through on the small promises, before you start making bigger ones. That evening, Marcus drove out to the Henderson house on Hill Street, drawn by curiosity about the estate sale's aftermath and the family whose hidden collection had transformed his life. The house was dark and showed signs of preparing for extended vacancy. Newspapers had accumulated on the porch, and the carefully maintained gardens were beginning to show neglect. Marcus parked across the street and studied the Victorian mansion that had housed generations of Cedar Falls' founding family. Robert Henderson had hidden his precious collection for decades, apparently never finding the right circumstances to retrieve it. Now that collection was providing opportunities that Henderson himself might never have imagined. A car pulled up behind Marcus, and he recognized Mayor Davidson climbing out to approach his window. "Thought I saw you over here," Davidson said. "Admiring your handiwork?" "Just thinking about the family that used to live here," Marcus replied. Wondering what Mr. Henderson would think about his collection ending up in the hands of someone trying to revitalize his hometown. Davidson looked thoughtful. Robert Henderson was a complicated man. He loved Cedar Falls, but he also made some financial decisions that hurt the family and cost other people their jobs. Maybe this is his way of making amends. They stood together in the gathering darkness, looking at the empty house that represented both Cedar Falls' prosperous past and its uncertain future. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility that came with his accidental fortune. The knowledge that his decisions over the coming months would affect not just his own life, but the lives of everyone who'd chosen to stay in this struggling community. "I want to make sure I do this right," Marcus said. "Not just the development projects, but the whole approach to helping people and strengthening the community." "The fact that you're thinking about it that way is encouraging," Davidson replied. "Most developers focus on profits and let everything else take care of itself. But you're right to be concerned about the human impact. That's what determines whether development actually helps a community or just changes it. As they talked, other cars began arriving on Hill Street. Marcus recognized Patricia Williams from the Salvation Army. Then Pastor Reynolds from the Methodist Church followed. By several other community leaders he'd met at the Chamber of Commerce meeting. "Informal town council meeting," Marcus asked Davidson. "Something like that. Word gets around fast in a small town, especially when someone starts making the kind of investments you're making. People want to understand what's happening and how it might affect them." Margaret Torres from the library was the last to arrive, carrying a folder of documents that she handed to Marcus. "I've been researching comparable development projects in similar communities," she said. "Thought you might be interested in some case studies of what worked and what didn't in towns like Livingston, Red Lodge, and Phillipsburg." Marcus accepted the folder gratefully, impressed by the thorough research Torres had conducted on her own initiative. The documents included newspaper articles, economic impact studies, and contact information for developers and city officials who'd managed successful small-town revitalization projects. "This is exactly what I need," Marcus said, scanning through the materials. "Thank you for putting this together." The impromptu gathering lasted nearly 2 hours, with community leaders sharing their perspectives on Marcus's plans and offering suggestions for avoiding common pitfalls in small-town development. The conversation was frank and sometimes challenging, but it reinforced Marcus's belief that success would require genuine community partnership rather than top-down decision-making. As the meeting broke up, Pastor Reynolds approached Marcus privately. "I appreciate what you're trying to do," he said, "but I want to make sure you understand the spiritual and emotional dimensions of what you're taking on. This community has been hurt repeatedly by economic disappointments and broken promises. People will test you, sometimes in ways that seem unfair or unreasonable, because they need to protect themselves from another letdown." Marcus nodded, understanding the pastor's concern. "How do you think I should handle that?" "Patience," Pastor Reynolds replied, "and humility. Remember that you're asking people to trust you with their hopes, which is one of the most valuable things they have left to give." Driving home that night, Marcus reflected on the complexity of his situation. The financial resources were the easy part. Money could buy materials, hire contractors, and purchase properties. The harder challenge was earning and maintaining the trust of a community that had learned to be skeptical of promises and protective of the little stability they'd managed to preserve. But the evening's conversations had also revealed something encouraging. Cedar Falls still contained people who cared deeply about their community and were willing to work toward its improvement. Success would depend on channeling that existing commitment, rather than trying to impose solutions from outside the community's existing networks and relationships. As Marcus settled into bed in his comfortable house on Elm Street, he could hear the sounds of Rodriguez's crew beginning early preparation work on the Pine Street properties. Tomorrow would bring the first visible signs of progress, concrete evidence that his plans were moving from conversation to reality. 6 months after Marcus Williams purchased a rusted metal box for 75 cents, Cedar Falls looked like a different town. The transformation wasn't complete. Small-town revitalization takes years, not months, but the changes were undeniable and inspiring. Most importantly, the improvements had created a momentum that extended far beyond Marcus's individual investments. The 3 Pine Street houses had been completed in early April, each one transformed from neglected property to attractive, modern homes. Rodriguez Construction had finished ahead of schedule and under budget, with work quality that exceeded everyone's expectations. 2 of the houses had sold immediately to young families, relocating from Billings, while the third was occupied by Tommy Chen under a rent-to-own agreement that included mental health support services coordinated by Jenny Morrison. Tommy's transformation had been particularly remarkable. With stable housing, consistent medication management, and meaningful work helping with landscaping projects around town, he'd become one of the most visible success stories of Marcus's community development efforts. His progress demonstrated that homelessness and mental illness weren't permanent conditions, but challenges that could be addressed with proper resources and support. The Woolworths building renovation had taken longer than anticipated, but was nearing completion in spectacular fashion. The main floor now housed Cedar Falls Market, a combination grocery store, deli, and coffee shop that had already become the town's unofficial community center. The second floor contained professional offices for a family law practice, an accounting firm that served the growing number of small businesses, and a conference room available for community meetings and events. More significantly, the grocery store was attracting customers from surrounding rural areas who appreciated both the selection and the personal service that had disappeared when chain stores closed. Daily foot traffic on Main Street had doubled since the store opened, creating opportunities for other businesses to succeed alongside Marcus's anchor investment. The Rialto Theatre renovation had begun in May, with completion scheduled for autumn. Marcus had formed a non-profit organization to manage the theatre, ensuring that programming would reflect community interests rather than purely commercial considerations. Advanced ticket sales for the planned opening season, including touring musicians, regional theatre productions, and classic film screenings, had already generated enough revenue to cover operating expenses for the first year. But the most significant change in Cedar Falls wasn't visible in buildings or businesses. It was the shift in community attitude from resignation to engagement, from isolation to collaboration. People who'd been planning to leave town were reconsidering their options. Residents who'd been merely surviving were beginning to think about ways they could contribute to continued improvement. Marcus observed this transformation from his office on the second floor of the Woolworths building, where he'd established Williams Development Company as the formal entity for his ongoing projects. The office was modest but professional, with large windows overlooking Main Street that allowed him to watch the daily activities of a community that was rediscovering its potential. His desk was covered with proposals and inquiries from other potential investors who'd heard about Cedar Falls' turnaround. A regional hotel chain wanted to discuss building a small inn near the theatre district. A craft brewery from Missoula was exploring the possibility of opening a second location. Even a small manufacturing company was considering relocating operations to take advantage of available industrial space and the growing workforce. Marcus was reviewing architectural plans for converting the old train station into a visitor center and museum when Jenny Morrison knocked on his office door. She'd become his unofficial community liaison, helping coordinate between various development projects and the residents they were designed to serve. "We've got a problem," Jenny announced, settling into the chair across from his desk. "A good problem, but still a problem." Marcus looked up from the blueprints. "What kind of problem?" "Housing. We've got 6 families wanting to move to Cedar Falls. People who work in Billings but want to live somewhere with lower costs and a better community, but we don't have anywhere to put them." It was indeed a good problem. Marcus's initial residential renovations had proven that there was demand for quality housing in Cedar Falls, but the supply remained limited. The city owned several more properties that could be developed, and there were private lots where new construction would be feasible. "What about the Henderson house?" Jenny suggested. "I know it's been sitting empty since the estate sale, and it's got to be the biggest residential property in town." Marcus had been thinking about the Henderson house for months, but had hesitated to pursue it. The Victorian mansion held symbolic importance as the former home of one of Cedar Falls' founding families, and Marcus felt a personal connection to the property through his discovery of Robert Henderson's hidden collection. "Do you know if it's still for sale?" Marcus asked. "I can find out. But Marcus, are you sure you want to take on something that big? That house would cost a fortune to renovate, and it's not exactly practical for most families." Jenny was right about the practical concerns, but Marcus had been developing an idea that might address multiple community needs simultaneously. The Henderson house could be converted into a community center and meeting space, with some residential units for visiting artists, temporary housing for people transitioning back into stable situations, and offices for non-profit organizations. "Let me make some calls," Marcus said, "and see if you can set up a meeting with the estate representatives." That afternoon, Marcus drove out to the Henderson property for the first time since his accidental fortune had begun. The house looked sad and neglected, with broken gutters, peeling paint, and gardens that were slowly reverting to wilderness. But the basic structure remained sound, and the architectural details were as impressive as ever. He walked around the property's perimeter, noting the detached garage where the estate sale had taken place and the small outbuilding that had probably served as a workshop. The lot was large enough to accommodate additional construction if the community center concept proved viable. Standing in the backyard where Robert Henderson had once tended prize-winning roses, Marcus reflected on the unlikely chain of events that had brought him to this moment. A man he'd never met had hidden a treasure that would eventually transform not just Marcus's life, but an entire community's prospects. It seemed fitting that the Henderson house should play a role in the ongoing revitalization efforts. His phone rang, interrupting his contemplation. The caller was Elizabeth Morrison from Heritage Numismatics in Billings. "Mr. Williams, I have some interesting news. We've had an inquiry from a museum in Denver about your Roman coin collection. They're interested in acquiring several pieces for a new exhibit on ancient trade routes, and they're prepared to offer premium prices for museum-quality specimens." Marcus had been considering additional sales from his collection to fund the expanding development projects. The museum opportunity would provide both excellent prices and the satisfaction of knowing that some of Robert Henderson's treasures would be preserved and displayed for educational purposes. "What kind of numbers are we talking about?" Marcus asked. "For 5 of your finest pieces, they're prepared to offer $200,000. It's significantly above normal market value, but they have grant funding specifically for acquisitions of this caliber. $200,000 would provide capital for major projects, including the Henderson House conversion and the visitor center development. It would also establish an endowment fund to support ongoing community programs and ensure the sustainability of his development efforts." "I'm interested," Marcus said. "Can you arrange for them to examine the pieces next week?" As evening approached, Marcus found himself walking through downtown Cedar Falls, observing the changes that had occurred since his discovery. The coffee corner was busy with customers who would have driven to Billings for dinner 6 months earlier. Harrison's hardware store was staying open later to serve the construction workers and new residents who were keeping the local economy active. Even the old barbershop had reopened under new management, providing services that people had been traveling out of town to find. The most significant change was less tangible but more important. People were talking about the future with optimism instead of discussing the past with regret. Children were playing in neighborhoods that had been quiet for years. Elderly residents were socializing more, energized by the increased activity and the sense that their community was worth investing in again. Marcus stopped at the Methodist church where Pastor Reynolds was locking up after the weekly community dinner. The program had expanded from serving 20 people to regularly hosting 60, including many new residents and workers from surrounding areas. "Marcus," Pastor Reynolds called out when he spotted him. "Perfect timing. I wanted to update you on the job training program." The program was another initiative that had grown from Marcus's original community development plans. Working with the regional community college, they'd established certification courses in construction trades, computer skills, and small business management. The classes were held in the renovated space above Cedar Falls Market, and students included both longtime residents looking to upgrade their skills and newcomers who wanted to contribute to the community's continued growth. "We've got our first graduating class next month," Pastor Reynolds continued. 12 people are completing various programs, and most of them already have job offers lined up with local businesses. Marcus felt pride in this achievement. The job training program represented exactly the kind of sustainable development he'd hoped to create. Improvements that would continue generating benefits long after his initial investments were complete. "There's something else I wanted to discuss," Pastor Reynolds said. "The Regional Development Office has approached me about nominating Cedar Falls for a State Community Revitalization Award. The recognition would be nice, but more importantly, it would attract additional grant funding and investment opportunities." As they talked, other community members began arriving for an evening planning meeting. Marcus recognized most of the faces now. Residents who'd become active participants in shaping their town's future rather than passive observers of its decline. Mayor Davidson was among the arrivals, carrying news about a major development that could accelerate Cedar Falls' economic recovery. The State Transportation Department has approved funding for highway improvements that will make Cedar Falls more accessible to tourism and commerce, Davidson announced. "It's partly because of the economic activity we've been able to demonstrate over the past 6 months. The highway improvements would complement the visitor center project and the theater renovation, creating infrastructure to support the heritage tourism and cultural activities that were becoming central to Cedar Falls' new economic identity." As the evening meeting progressed, Marcus listened to reports from various committees and working groups that had formed organically around different aspects of community development: housing, business recruitment, tourism promotion, historic preservation. Residents had taken ownership of initiatives that had begun with his investments, but now extended far beyond what any single person could have accomplished alone. Dr. Rodriguez reported that a second physician had committed to joining her practice, attracted by the community's growth and the improved housing options. The library board had secured funding for technology upgrades and expanded programming. Even the school district was seeing enrollment increases as families chose to relocate to Cedar Falls rather than leaving for opportunities elsewhere. The meeting concluded with discussion of a community celebration planned for Labor Day weekend, featuring the theater's opening season, a harvest festival in the downtown area, and guided tours of the historic properties that had been restored over the past year. The celebration would serve as both a commemoration of the progress achieved and a marketing event to attract additional visitors and potential residents. Walking home after the meeting, Marcus passed the 3 Pine Street houses where lights were on and families were settling into their evening routines. The houses represented his first concrete achievement, but more importantly, they demonstrated that positive change was possible and had inspired others to pursue their own improvement projects. Back at his house on Elm Street, Marcus sat on his front porch and reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him from homelessness to community leadership in less than a year. The metal box sat in his home office now, still containing most of Robert Henderson's collection, but its significance had evolved from personal salvation to community foundation. Tomorrow will bring new challenges and opportunities. The museum sale would provide funding for expanded projects The Henderson House conversion would create a community asset that could serve Cedar Falls for generations. The continued growth in business activity and population would require careful management to ensure that development enhanced rather than overwhelmed the town's character. But tonight, Marcus simply enjoyed the satisfaction of seeing his impossible dream becoming reality. A community that had been dying was thriving again. People who had been struggling were finding opportunities. A town that had been forgotten was being rediscovered. The transformation of Cedar Falls proved that sometimes the most valuable discoveries aren't just about individual fortune. They're about the potential for one person's good luck to become an entire community's renewal. Robert Henderson's hidden treasure had accomplished something that the original owner probably never intended. It had shown a struggling town that prosperity was still possible, that people still cared enough to invest in each other's futures, and that sometimes the most important inheritance isn't money, but hope. As Marcus prepared for bed, he could hear the sounds of a community settling into another peaceful night. Families in comfortable homes, businesses preparing for another day of serving customers, and residents looking forward to a future that finally held more promise than uncertainty. It was the sound of a town that had remembered how to believe in itself, and it was the most beautiful music Marcus had ever heard. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Marcus was reviewing contractor bids for the Henderson House project when Jenny knocked on his office door, followed by 3 people he didn't immediately recognize. "Marcus, I'd like you to meet the Yamamoto family," Jenny said. They drove up from Denver after reading about Cedar Falls in a magazine article. The family consisted of parents in their 40s and a teenage daughter who was photographing everything with obvious excitement. Dr. Kenji Yamamoto introduced himself as a software engineer who'd been working remotely since the pandemic and was looking for a small community where his family could start a bed and breakfast business. "We've been researching small towns across the Mountain West," Dr. Yamamoto explained. "Cedar Falls keeps appearing in discussions about successful rural revitalization. When we read about the theater renovation and the new businesses opening, we decided to visit and see if there might be opportunities for us here." His wife, Sarah, was a former restaurant manager with experience in hospitality operations. Their daughter, Emma, was a high school junior interested in historic preservation and community planning. They represented exactly the kind of family that Cedar Falls needed: educated professionals with entrepreneurial energy and genuine interest in contributing to small-town life. Marcus spent 2 hours showing them around town, explaining the various development projects and introducing them to other business owners. The Yamamotos were particularly interested in the Henderson House project, seeing potential for their bed and breakfast concept in the mansion's grand rooms and historical significance. "What would you think about partnering with us on the Henderson property?" Sarah Yamamoto asked as they toured the neglected mansion. "We could handle the hospitality aspects while you focus on the community center elements. Historic inns are popular with tourists, especially when they're connected to interesting local stories." The proposal intrigued Marcus. The Henderson House was large enough to accommodate both functions, and a partnership would provide professional hospitality management while sharing the substantial renovation costs. More importantly, the Yamamotos brought skills and experience that would enhance the project's long-term success. That afternoon, Marcus called Elizabeth Morrison to accelerate the museum sale of his Roman coins. The additional capital would allow him to pursue the Henderson House partnership while maintaining his other development commitments. "Actually, I have even better news," Morrison said when he explained his timeline needs. "The Denver museum sale fell through. They couldn't get final approval for the grant funding. But I've had inquiries from two private collectors who are willing to pay even more for immediate purchase. One collector in particular is offering $250,000 for 5 specific pieces from your collection. The increased offer would provide more than enough funding for the Henderson House Partnership and several additional projects Marcus had been considering. He arranged to meet with the collector the following week, bringing the coins Morrison had identified as being of greatest interest. Meanwhile, the Yamamotos extended their stay in Cedar Falls, renting one of the furnished apartments above the grocery store, while they developed detailed plans for the Henderson House bed and breakfast. Emma Yamamoto had become fascinated with the town's history, spending hours at the library researching the Henderson family and the mining era that had shaped Cedar Falls' early development. Her research uncovered information that even Margaret Torres hadn't discovered. Robert Henderson had been not just a mine owner, but also an amateur archaeologist who'd collected Native American artifacts and geological specimens throughout the region. Some of those items might still be stored somewhere on the Henderson property, potentially adding to the historical significance of the restoration project. There are references in old newspaper articles to Henderson's Natural History Museum. Emma explained to Marcus and her parents during dinner at the coffee corner. He apparently displayed his collections in the mansion's 3rd floor, though that area wasn't included in the estate sale. The possibility of additional historical artifacts added another dimension to the Henderson House project. If Emma's research was correct, the property might contain items of significant archaeological and cultural value that would enhance both the bed and breakfast concept and the community center functions. Dr. Yamamoto had been conducting his own research, focusing on the economic potential of heritage tourism in the region. His analysis suggested that Cedar Falls was positioned to become a destination for visitors interested in mining history, outdoor recreation, and cultural activities. The theater creates an anchor for cultural tourism, he explained. The restored historic buildings provide an authentic Western atmosphere. Add quality lodging and dining, and you have the components for a sustainable tourism economy that complements rather than competes with the existing business base. His economic projections showed that successful heritage tourism could support dozens of additional businesses and hundreds of jobs over the next decade. More importantly, tourism revenue would provide economic stability that was less dependent on the boom and bust cycles that had historically affected extractive industries in the region. The following week brought Marcus's trip to Billings for the coin sale, accompanied by the Yamamotos, who wanted to finalize legal arrangements for their Henderson House partnership. The collector, William Ashford, was a retired investment banker who developed a passion for ancient numismatics and had been building a world-class collection for over 20 years. Ashford examined each coin with the reverence of a true connoisseur, appreciating not just their monetary value, but their historical significance and artistic beauty. The transaction took place in his private office, surrounded by display cases containing some of the finest ancient coins Marcus had ever seen. These pieces will be treasured and properly preserved, Ashford assured Marcus as they completed the paperwork. I understand they were part of a collection assembled over many years by someone who truly appreciated their historical importance. The sale provided Marcus with the capital he needed, while ensuring that Robert Henderson's most valuable coins would continue to be preserved and appreciated by someone who understood their significance. It felt like an appropriate outcome for treasures that had been hidden for so many decades. Back in Cedar Falls, the Henderson House partnership moved forward rapidly. Legal documents were prepared, establishing a joint venture between Williams Development and Yamamoto Hospitality. Architectural plans were developed for converting the mansion's main floor to reception areas and dining space, the 2nd floor, to to guest rooms and the third floor to community meeting space and Emma's proposed local history museum. The renovation would be extensive, but not overwhelming. The house's original character would be preserved while updating utilities, accessibility, features and safety systems to modern standards. The project would create employment for local contractors and craftspeople, while establishing Cedar Falls as a destination for visitors seeking authentic small-town experiences. Construction began in late August, with Rodriguez Construction coordinating a team of specialists in historic preservation, hospitality design, and museum display systems. The work attracted visitors who were curious about the progress, creating additional awareness of Cedar Falls' transformation and generating advance bookings for the bed and breakfasts projected opening the following spring. Emma Yamamoto's research proved accurate when workers discovered a locked room on the mansion's third floor containing Robert Henderson's natural history collections. The artifacts included Native American pottery, arrowheads, and tools, geological specimens from throughout the region, and historical photographs and documents related to the area's mining and railroad development. The discovery required consultation with tribal representatives and state archaeologists to ensure proper handling and display of culturally significant items. The process delayed the renovation schedule, but added authenticity and educational value that would enhance the museum's appeal to visitors and researchers. By early September, Cedar Falls had attracted attention from state tourism officials, who were impressed by the community's revitalization success. Governor Janet Mills visited during the Labor Day weekend celebration, touring the completed projects and meeting with business owners and residents who'd participated in the transformation. Cedar Falls represents the best of Montana's small-town spirit and entrepreneurial creativity, the governor said during a speech at the theater's opening night performance. This community has shown that rural revitalization is possible when people work together with vision, commitment, and mutual support. The governor's visit generated statewide media coverage that attracted additional investors, tourists, and potential residents. Real estate inquiries increased dramatically, and several businesses began exploring expansion or relocation opportunities in Cedar Falls. Marcus watched the opening night performance from the restored theater's balcony, surrounded by community members who'd worked to make the evening possible. The program featured local musicians, a one-act play performed by high school students, and a presentation about the building's restoration that received sustained applause. As the curtain fell and the audience began filtering out into the crisp September evening, Marcus reflected on how far Cedar Falls had come since his discovery of the metal box at the estate sale. The town had not just recovered its economic vitality, but had developed a new identity as a community that could adapt, innovate, and thrive despite the challenges of economic change. The transformation would continue in the months and years ahead. The Henderson House Bed and Breakfast would open in the spring, providing lodging for the growing number of visitors. Additional businesses would establish operations to serve both residents and tourists. The job training programs would expand to meet increasing demand for skilled workers. But the most important transformation had already occurred. Cedar Falls had rediscovered its confidence and sense of possibility. People who'd been planning to leave were staying and investing in improvements. Young families were choosing to raise their children in a community that offered both small-town values and economic opportunities. Elderly residents were enjoying their retirement years in a town that was vibrant and forward-looking, rather than declining and forgotten. Walking home through streets that now bustled with evening activity, Marcus knew that Robert Henderson's hidden treasure had accomplished something far more valuable than individual wealth. It has provided the catalyst for community renewal, demonstrating that sometimes the most important discoveries benefit not just the finder, but everyone whose lives they touch. The metal box sat in his home office now, still containing the remaining coins and gems that represented his long-term financial security, but the real treasure had been the opportunity to help transform a community from decline to growth, from despair to hope, from isolation to collaboration. Cedar Falls, Montana, had become proof that small-town America could reinvent itself when people refused to accept decline as inevitable. And Marcus Williams had learned that the greatest fortune wasn't gold or precious stones, but the chance to make a difference in the place he called home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.